I'm so happy to be in person again. It's really, and I appreciate all the people who are watching online as well, but you know, in the past few years when you give a lecture in Zoom or on the internet and you don't have any of the human reactions, sometimes you don't know. So I really appreciate all of you who are nodding or making eye contact. It's very much appreciated, and I didn't even know I missed it until we didn't have it, so thank you. So I'm going to take a step back and talk about dignity of risk and who was the person who even thought of this concept. The gentleman was Robert Persky, who coined the term. He was born in 1927 and he died in 2018. According to his obituary, he began his career as an ordained Methodist minister, serving as a chaplain at the Kansas Neurological Institute, which was a state institution for boys and girls with intellectual disabilities. He authored 16 books, many of them were illustrated by his wife, Martha, and he wrote countless articles calling for a fairer and richer social justice for persons with disabilities. A website that's based on his contributions noted that he joined volunteer organizations fighting to get people with disabilities out of institutions and back into regular neighborhoods. During these community-based efforts, he slowly metamorphosed into what they called a street, court, and prison worker with persons having intellectual disabilities. He actually is most well known for advocating for prisoners with intellectual disabilities who had confessed to crimes they had not committed and worked to get those overturned. So he's a fascinating person throughout his life, and he wrote this about 51 years ago, and he died in 2018. About 40 years ago, Martha Persky, who was his wife, designed the 1981 18 cents International Year of the Disabled Persons stamp. And I think this image is really beautiful. Disabled doesn't mean unable. And you know, 40-something years ago, it still is important for us to remember about all the stigma and all of the other things, the assumptions that are in society sometimes about people with different kinds of disabilities. And so I feel very grateful to learn that this like academic concept that I'm trying to apply to clinical care has very deep roots in social justice and in inequality and in decreasing wrong ideas and stigma. So yes, I love this. I found this like, through apparently there's like a stamp museum where you can find all different stamps, and I had read about this one, and so I found this image online. When Robert Persky first wrote about the dignity of risk, he was the executive director of the Greater Omaha Association for Retarded Children, which was the term used at the time. He had completed a study tour in Sweden and Denmark, where he observed innovative programs that were being tried, and he questioned the American approach of what he saw as overprotection. He wrote, quote, "Every day there is a possibility of being thrown up against a situation where we may have to risk everything, even our lives. This is the real world. We must work to develop every human resource within us to prepare for these days. To deny any retarded person," which was the term he used, "his fair share of risk experiences is to further cripple him for healthy living. Mentally retarded persons may, can, will, and should respond to risk with full human dignity and courage." So he was really interested in these different programs that were being tried that were allowing people to take reasonable risks and to enjoy the positive aspects of risk-taking instead of just overprotecting and worrying about you know, people harming themselves. And I've actually never been to Sweden or Denmark. How many people have been to either one of those countries? Oh, nice. So I imagine that the healthcare system there, and maybe also the cultural values and attitudes, probably really encourage that. When I worked in India, my family is originally from there, but I also spent a year in Kolkata, India, which was called Calcutta before. And you know, the cultural values, the religious perspectives, the ways that families live mean that brain injury looks a little bit different there. because of all of those factors. Even the words we use and the language we use for different kinds of disability are very different. I even slightly see a difference between the US and Canada, which are very close neighbors and very similar. But it's important that Robert Persky found this idea and thought about this as he traveled to Northern Europe and thought, oh, maybe we aren't doing this the right way. And maybe we need to treat people with a little more respect. Here's another example from Australia, where anecdotally it seems that the term is more commonly used. In fact, if you Google a YouTube video from the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission in Australia, there's a 1-minute and 40-second video about the dignity of risk in aged care. The crux of the issue for people with brain injury is the duty to care versus the dignity of risk. This is from this website, after a traumatic brain injury, life takes a significant turn for our clients. For some, the change to their cognitive skills means they are no longer able to make independent decisions. For others, it means they may need help to consider all their options before making decisions. And they talk about the duty of care, which is a legal term with clearly defined meaning. It's the responsibility of organizations and people who work in them to ensure they do no harm to the people they support. They have a duty to care. But it doesn't mean that the organization has to protect the person from themselves. So dignity of risk refers to the right of an individual to make decisions and choices and take risks in order to learn, grow, and have a better quality of life. So they are talking about it quite a bit in Australia as well. And inherent to this idea is that life experiences come with an element of risk which we can't avoid. So even the best planning and best supports, you can't live a risk-free kind of life. Oops, I'm sorry, that was a slide for that. I like this image very much because, it's showing that even if you wrap somebody in all kinds of materials, or we may think of a young child, people are still going to live in the world, and there are certain risks. And this was, again, from that Australian from Rehab Connection, and they talk about the duty of care and the dignity of risk. And it's often in this kind of tension. How much do we care for somebody, which obviously is a very good thing, but also how much do we allow them to take some risks and to really respect their dignity? All right, are there any questions at this point? You've understood what I'm saying? Yes?
Do you mind just repeating that definition? It was very good.
Sure. The definition that I may have written down, yes. Dignity of risk refers to the right of an individual to make choices and take risks in order to learn, grow, and have a better quality of life. And if you have access to the slides, this rehabconnection.com.au actually has this definition, and they talk about it a little bit, and it's an excellent resource for that. So there was a recent special issue in the journal Perspectives in Biology and Medicine on the dignity of risk. The authors were invited to explore the concept in practice and to consider nuances, complexities, recommendations. Who is allowed and not allowed to take risks? How is the clinician and patient relationship impacted? What are the intersections between clinics and communities where this concept can be helpful? How do policies and laws impact it? And as I wrote in the introduction, respect for persons and their potentially risky choices are also about social justice, particularly in a world full of inequities, historical injustices, and human biases. I love this image of justice. It's from the Wisconsin State Capitol building. That really reminds us that some of the historical things that have been experienced in the world have meant that there are already some systematic biases and injustices. And if we think about dignity of risk in a very careful and thoughtful way, maybe we can help alleviate some of those those injustices. I mean, I'm always an optimist, and so that's what I hope for, and people were really thinking about this in terms of social justice. The essays in this special issue are clustered and envisioned to be in conversation, and the collection opens with a section on dignity, risk, and lived experience with a piece by Judy Pankow-Rees, who was a healthcare policy analyst who sustained a traumatic brain injury in 1980, and her co-author and colleague Marilyn Martin. And in Judy's narrative, as a survivor of brain injury, she talks about her own career path as a woman with a brain injury, and she writes about the risk of unemployment and the dignity of forging her own path. And another paper specifically about brain injury, entitled The Dignity of Risk, Re-Emergent Agency, and the Central Thalamic Stimulation Trial for Moderate to Severe Brain Injury, Joseph Finns and Megan Wright explore how subjects and families are deciding to enroll in research, and how they negotiated the informed consent process, and how the subjects had decisional incapacity, but then they regained their capacity, and how the power sharing kind of shifted over time. But it's really interesting. A lot of acquired brain injuries are not static. People are improving, and at what point do we think about allowing people and encouraging people to make more of their own decisions, especially if family members may be used to making them? So that's another kind of very interesting topic. And it's not just like major decisions, like informed consent for a clinical trial, but even more minor decisions. You know, what you're gonna do that day, who you're gonna be friends with, what you're gonna eat, you know, getting back to the example of food. So there's a lot of different decisions. In reproductive medicine, this is there was another many essays in this collection, and if you're interested, again, the slides will have the reference. There's another essay about adolescent decision making and how adolescents are often like very at a developmental stage where they are taking a lot of risks, and how do we think about encouraging sound judgment and thinking through things, but also encouraging their independence. And so that's a really interesting piece written by a neuropsychologist. So you can see that this dignity of risk has lots of different applications. In reproductive medicine, Katie Watson has used the concept of risk in abortion care and the concept of regret. She writes, acknowledging the dignity of risk doesn't mean physicians should stop trying to help patients. Instead, when patients internalize the locus of control for their choices and actions, informed decisions they later regret are viewed as an opportunity for growth, a time when health professionals can help patients use the experience to redefine or strengthen life goals, devise new strategies for achieving them, and develop resilience. So this is about, you know, she talked about also that it was something that challenges clinicians' impulse to withhold options from people with disabilities unless good outcomes are guaranteed. And it's shorthand for the fact that there is no opportunity for success without a right to failure. And nobody wants to fail, but all of us do fail at some point. So who decides what that is? I don't have any great answers for these things that I'm asking, but I just want us, I guess, to think a little bit more broadly and open-mindedly about how we behave with each other and how we think about things, if that makes sense. Yes?
Can you say something more about the decision-making process for the people around us who we've trained on how to cope with our brain injuries, but we really want them to stop catering so much? How do you make the decision or help them decide that, you know what, you can back off a little bit now, I'm okay? Because, you know, as you said, brain injuries change. We get better, we develop coping strategies and so on.
Right.
So what can we say about that decision making and how we do it?
Wow, that is an excellent question. So he's asking about how we think about decision making and how we encourage people who we've actually really relied on and who have learned how to support us to back off. And I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I do think this thinking about dignity of risk and thinking about things being constantly changing. Even if you think about our natural life process, all of us have changed over the years. And because you've had a brain injury doesn't mean that you won't continue to change and grow and mature or learn new things and maybe forget some things as we age. So I think just reminding your loved ones and yourself that maybe what I needed yesterday is not what I'm going to need tomorrow. And I think that that is really sometimes not very easy to do. We get into very deep habits. I'm trained as a psychologist, so I can't help but be a psychologist. And I even think of my own habits. Usually, especially loved ones who have accompanied someone through the brain injury journey, care very deeply and maybe have seen somebody go through some very traumatic situations. But how do you let go and realize, okay, now we're in a different phase and we can relax a little bit, and maybe it's okay for me to allow that person to do some things, and maybe it's okay for me to do something for myself and just be their loved one again and not. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm really glad you raised it. I think it's really tough. I kind of did? Okay, that's good. I'll take kind of did. That's a win for me, thank you. All right, so I wanted to share this example from my colleague Judy Penko-Reese, who is a woman who wrote about taking risks as a woman living with TBI. And again, she was talking about finding employment. So she had gone back to a job that she had had before. She had she was attacked while she was tent camping in Hawaii and had a very severe traumatic brain injury, and after a very long and arduous rehabilitation process, was ready to go back to work. And they were suggesting that she go back to the same place she used to work in a different position. And at first she accepted that, but after she went back, she was like, I just can't do this. I never wanted to do this, and I had left this place. I didn't want to be here. And so she took some real risks by, especially, it's very hard to get employment sometimes. And she looks back now and talks about that process in this essay. And as she writes here, finding quality employment and guidance with a brain injury proved more difficult than expected. It had never occurred to me that professionals who once regarded me with respect would no longer perceive me with the same high regard as they did before my brain injury. My rehab therapists knew how unfriendly the world could be to brain injured folks. They also understood the complexities of my injuries, but this was something that I needed to discover for myself. I needed to come to terms with the nature of my cognitive and physical limitations. Looking back, I doubt that I, with my disabilities, would have achieved the many career successes ahead of me had I not experienced these setbacks. So again, this is the concept of failing, learning from that in order to succeed later. And I recommend this essay very much, especially because of her experiences as a person with brain injury. All right, so I'm going to talk very briefly about decisional capacity, because when people are thinking about risk and dignity, we let people who have what we perceive to be capacity make all kinds of decisions. In North America, we even allow them to withdraw life-sustaining treatment or to seek assistance in dying. We really give people who have capacity the right to make decisions that other people disagree with. Some of you may be familiar with this, maybe the medical students who are presenting today may be familiar with the criteria that was proposed by a psychiatrist, Paul Applebaum, who's written widely on capacity about the different things that go into assessing someone's capacity. I'll quickly touch on 4 of the criteria and ask the audience to consider how they may impact risk assessment and dignity. So the first is the ability to communicate a choice. This can be via verbal or nonverbal means. and the stability of choices is assessed. And of course, this can be difficult for someone who is maybe perseverating on their choices or due to impairment. But it is, you have to be able to actually communicate your choice. You have to understand relevant information, which include basic abilities to receive, store, remember, and if you have difficulties in intelligence or memory or attention span, they can interfere with this understanding. And then to test this understanding, you ask people to paraphrase what they have been told. In my previous life, when I was working on my master's and PhD, I actually was working very closely with in neuropsychology. I thought I was going to be a neuropsychologist working in brain injury. And then my career took a bit of a different turn because I ended up doing my PhD dissertation on withdrawal of life support after severe traumatic brain injury, which is a decision that sometimes people make. And it was something that took my career on a whole different path. Thinking about, how do people make these decisions? Why do they make them? What are the implications? And then, like 20 years later, I'm doing something a little bit different. But I still think back to my neuropsych background sometimes when I'm thinking about capacity. Appreciation of the situation and its consequences. So you have to grasp the probable outcomes and consequences. So do you know what the actual decision is and what happens if you refuse that decision? That's another part of this. And then rational manipulation of information. Do people use a logical process and a benefit and risk analysis? It doesn't mean that you agree with the person who's asking you questions, but just that you're reasoning appropriately. And sometimes, especially for people with brain injuries, you have to give them a long time. It can't be a quick decision and a quick series of questions to see if they really have capacity. You have to have enough time and space for people to think through and how they're thinking through. So these are the kinds of things that clinicians use for thinking about how to assess capacity. When I was an ethics fellow at the University of Chicago, my postdoc project was on clinician perspectives on decision-making capacity. These were people who were employed by a county hospital with multiple levels of care, including acute, rehabilitation, ambulatory, and skilled care. And they had brain injury programs. And there was various focus groups that I did, and there were 33 healthcare providers, including people on the night staff, and the evening, as well as the day staff, from various disciplines. And when I asked them about how they would define decision-making capacity, which is a little bit different than the way that I just talked about it, they talked about a multidimensional rather than a unitary definition. So they thought about being able to be safe, being able to take care of some activities of daily living, to be oriented and alert, to behave appropriately, to correctly assess what he or she needs, to display appropriate task responses. The list goes on, which you can see. And again, these are important and really interesting and critical, but on the other hand, I would invite us to think about, if someone doesn't quite meet all of these criteria, how do you still engage with and encourage, and if you think they don't quite meet all of this checklist kind of criteria? And that's where I think there's a space for the dignity of risk, quite honestly, in that space in between, if that makes sense to people. Okay, good. They also asked about how people learn this. I mean, as new clinicians are learning how to work with people with brain injury, and they were saying that everybody's different. I find you get some information from a book. Usually you find that people are much harder than the book and much more complicated. It's never that cut and dry. So you may have very well-meaning clinicians, and I'm one of those and was and still am, who think, oh, I've got all this knowledge, I've learned all this stuff, but when you're in front of a human being, it's not that cut and dry. And you have some ideas, but you have to have some flexibility in your thinking, and thinking about what it means to respect. Even if you're, kind of puzzling, like, what's going on here? Well, let me take a step back and try to understand what's going on here instead of shutting it down. So I think that that's another kind of important. I guess I would say if there's like 2 things I want you to take from like all this talking I'm doing this morning. One is to think about what this idea is of the dignity of risk that Robert Persky talked about in 1972 and what that might mean in day-to-day interactions. And the second one is, as our initial comments said, to think about some humility and some kindness as we engage with other people, and especially humility. And if you're a clinician, some clinical humility, because you'll never fully be able to be in someone else's body and brain and understanding, so having some space for that. So those are the 2 things that I hope people take from today. So just to summarize, capacity is decision specific. Assessments are also done at one point in time. It's very hard to say if someone will have future capacity, again, because people are changing and developing. There's also something which is a whole different topic called performative capacity, whether someone can actually perform what they're saying they want to do, which is really becomes quite complicated in rehabilitation, because you could interview somebody and they can say the correct things, but then they're unable to actually do it. And so that's a different kind of capacity, which we need to be careful of if there's certain things that we think are unsafe. And then the idea about other people speaking on behalf of somebody, but involving the person with the brain injury. All right. And I am doing okay on time, so any questions at this point? I so appreciate everybody's attention this morning, and first of all for being here, but second of all, I feel very listened to and welcomed, and I really do appreciate that, because it's a lot of information. It's not super early, but it is a little early in the morning for a lot of information and thinking about these big concepts. So I'm going to think about risk now. So in this study entitled Occupational Therapists and Physiotherapists Weighing Up on the Dignity of Risk for People Living with a Brain Injury, Grounded Theory, they conducted semi-structured in-depth interviews of 10 occupational therapists and 7 physiotherapists. And they talk about this idea of weighing up. The process of weighing up was central to the therapist's approach. Respecting dignity itself is placed at risk when preventing harm is weighted higher than living a full life. Respecting dignity itself is at risk when preventing harm is weighed higher than living a full life. So I think this is very much what we've been talking about with dignity of risk. Therapists use weighing up as a process that respects dignity and thinking about autonomy and justice for people with brain injury. So they had to think about whether people had the ability to make sensible and safe decisions, whether the client had a low tolerance for risk and change, or whether the client had impulsive tendencies which made them vulnerable to physical harms. And they say, rather than taking control and attempting to minimize risk, therapists who privilege the perspectives of the client and provide opportunities for learning through failure or success enable clients to live a full life. So they're kind of, in all these various ways are finding that like giving people a little bit more ability to fail or to take some personal risks lead to a better quality of life. And so I thought that was very interesting. Let's think a little bit more about how risk is defined. And in this piece, I'm going to rely on the piece that I wrote for the special collection on dignity of risk and attributions about the other. In my 20 plus years of doing clinical ethics consults, the variability among multidisciplinary clinicians who are considering risks is notable. In my former job in rehabilitation with colleagues who are more attuned to disability perspectives, risk might be considered with one set of facts. With supports, technology, and/or training, some things can become less risky. For example, an accessible medical alert system connected to emergency services may ease safety concerns for someone who lives alone. Yet other common concepts can be limiting. For example, the recommendation of needing supervision 24/7 is common across rehabilitation therapies, and I see it now that I work in acute care as well. The idea is that based on assessments in the hospital, there is too much risk if the individual is unsupervised when they are back in the community. Some risks are personal, such as falling and risking future injuries. Some are interpersonal or communal, the risk of starting a fire after leaving a stove unattended, the risk of getting lost while wandering in the community or driving unsafely. And this idea of who needs the supervision 24/7 often came up, and families would actually remind us their loved ones didn't actually receive 24/7 supervision in the hospital either, and probably wouldn't in a nursing home, yet we were so focused on this concept. Others wondered if we were discriminating against people who lived alone and did not have someone to move in with them. In response to these concerns, our ethics team had pulled together a group of multidisciplinary clinicians, including physical, occupational and speech language therapy, medicine, nursing, psychology, social work, and ethics. And there had been some work done on this before, but we aim to think about reframing 24/7 recommendations into specific recommendations for physical supervision, cognitive supervision, and help with activities of daily living. And this broke down the idea of a risky person who needs protection all day and all night, and instead focused on specific domains where risk could be actually assessed. And we also tried to think about the tasks instead of the number of hours. So if someone needs help with A, B, C, D, not like saying things like 24/7. And that helped people kind of think about things a little bit differently. In my current setting, we also discuss safe enough discharges very often, and we dig deeper into the types and magnitude and potential sources of strength that will minimize risks. And the spaces of disagreement are often among even team members. One person will say, oh, no, that's too risky. Another one will say, no, that's fine. They were living like that before, so who are we to say? And so having the conversations and sitting down also leads to some creative brainstorming. So the physical, social, and psychological risks, there are physical risks such as falling, but there are also psychological risks such as a diminished sense of control, and social risks such as isolation and marginalization. So we get very focused on maybe the physical risks, and we forget about other risks like social. Isolation is a really big problem for all of us in society. And anything we can do to decrease that isolation, even if it means maybe a slightly riskier situation, may be appropriate. And we also think about the way that risk is framed. We often think of risks and benefits, like ethics consultations, debates about the right things to do, like what's the benefit, what's the risks. We also hear people thinking about risks and safety, but we don't think as much in clinical care about risks and empowerment. This is what Persky was referring to in his original article, and the way that many disability advocacy organizations think about risk. Supported decision-making, allowing people graduated risks. This is something that is about empowering people. It's not about like ignoring risk. Listen, I'm not advocating that we just like let people do whatever they want everywhere. It's just that we maybe need to open our ideas a little bit and like support people going forward to make things that may have a better quality of life. Does that make sense? Okay, good. And I think that's what I wanted to say with that slide. Okay. So we'll move from the multiple ways that risk is framed to the assessment of risk. Risk is typically defined and apprehended separately by the actor and the observer, and it can shift according to time, place, context, and voice. So there is a person who seems to be taking the risks, and there's someone else who's deciding or kind of judging that person. And if you think about, how good we are at assessing this, we're not as good as we would think we are. And as I said in the introduction, I worked in 9 different hospital settings in the Eastern and Midwestern United States, and 2 settings during 1-year stints in France and in India. And there's even sometimes a local culture about how people are thinking about what's risk. If you're at a county hospital where you have various patients, or if you're at a private hospital, if you're clientele, it impacts all of that. So I think like even this evidence about risk assessment is not just like actuarial and like counting things, if that makes sense. So there are, as we're thinking about assessing risk, we have some cognitive biases. Cognitive biases this is a bit simplistic, but they are cognitive shortcuts that stream information processing, especially when we are processing lots of complex information. This is how we function as humans. It's not pathological, it's human. So we make quick judgments sometimes, and sometimes they're systematically errors. So for example, how many of you have heard of the confirmation bias? Oh good, a lot of you. I love this. You'd rather stand in line for a reassuring lie than an inconvenient truth. We favor information that confirms our own beliefs or hypotheses. We interpret ambiguous information as supportive of our own beliefs. We attend to information selectively. We remember information selectively. When we have deeply held beliefs, we hear things sometimes very differently, and it's very stronger for something that's emotionally laden. So you may be looking at the same set of facts, but you may confirm what you already know. So if you think that's a risky person, you may look at all the things as being kind of risky. If you think that's a pretty safe situation, you may ignore some of the things that might be risky to somebody else. And again, this is just the way that humans think about ideas. Another thing is we think about, when there's highly emotional things, we may be focused on that one red dot and ignore all the green stuff around us. That's the way that our brains process information. All of our brains, regardless of whether you had a brain injury or not. And so I think that, thinking about how we're assessing and who we are thinking about these things is also part of this. I love this also. We may look at the exact same things, and depending where you're standing, you're gonna see something totally different. One person sees a 6, another person sees a 9. And if you were standing on the side, you might see not a number at all, but some kind of a maze or something. So your perspective really does matter. And when you're a clinician, you have very brief encounters with people in medical settings, and sometimes the dominance of the framing in the medical record will impact how you're looking at the information. And when you take a step back and look at narrative data and talk to the people and talk to the people around them, you may get something more, you might shift from the 6 to the 9, if that makes sense. I am gonna get a drink of water for just 1 minute, so if anybody has a question, I had a water glass right there. I have about 10 more minutes of my talk, but I just realized if that's okay with everybody? Okay, so again, perspective really matters. And there's just about 10 minutes left, so I hope that you're all doing okay. I appreciate everybody staying with me. There's one more thing that I want to talk about, or a few more things I want to talk about. Something this is from like the social psychology literature. It's called the fundamental attribution error. So we think of our own behaviors as based on the situation, but others' behavior as based on who they are. So for example, if you see someone who's late to a meeting, you'll say, oh my God, that person is always late. That's who they are, they never show up on time. If you're late, you're like, well, I was stuck in traffic, I had a hard time getting out this day, it's about the situation, it's only today. And this happens like across so many studies over so many years. There was even like an undergrad study, like if you were an English major, you thought English majors were like much more diverse and like hard to categorize, but like physics majors were very much the same as each other. And if you were a physics major, you thought the exact opposite. So it's like the in-group, out-group, and like whether you think something is like situational or dispositional. And this also impacts the way we think about risk and we think about dignity. I know I can do that, but we're not sure that other person can do that. Give them a label, especially like a medical label, and then we have a lot of ideas about what that label means. So this is I think, an interesting concept. Someone may be considered a dispositional risk taker rather than an individual who weighs information according to their own values and reacts to the specific situation. Some people with brain injury may return to their pre-morbid level of risk-taking, what they were doing before they had the brain injury. And it's hard to tease apart the role of the situation and the role of the person. And so it's, again, a good reminder to think about that. This is also called the actor-observer asymmetry. So you're the observer, and then there's the person who's acting, and you're judging. And this is thinking about person versus situation. If you have information differences, if you have attentional differences, and if you have motivational differences, then you can think about things a little bit differently. So for example, if you think about the motivations of healthcare professionals, you may be motivated to decrease risk, as you understand it, for really beneficent and good reasons, or even legally protective reasons. And so, you're focusing on, again, like the medical information, on this like limited amount of time you see things, and then you also may have different motivations than the person living with the injury themselves. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this article that came out about 50 years ago called On Being Sane in Insane Places. Has anybody heard of that? It was somebody named Jay Rosenhan, who was a psychiatrist, and he described the experience of 8 pseudo-patients who got themselves admitted to psychiatric hospitals and then behaved, quote, normally, and they were undetected as faking and unable to be discharged. The psychiatric hospitals in the study were in 5 different states in the United States, with a range of resources and with public and private funding. The pseudo-patients claimed to have auditory hallucinations and were admitted to the facility, and then stopped endorsing any symptoms and just acted like they did outside. If the staff in Rosenhan's study had interviewed the participants immediately after their admission and assessed their current functioning, it is argued, they would have been discharged immediately. Instead, it took an average of 19 days, with a range from 7 to 52 days for the participants to be released, and most were released with a diagnosis of, quote, schizophrenia in remission. So this was something that was very controversial at the time when it came out. Psychiatrists actually had a lot of critiques of it. But generations of mental health professionals have read this paper, and you think about it, he talks about depersonalization, about medical hierarchies, and that sometimes actually the patients around the pseudo-patients were like, this person shouldn't be here, what are they doing here? But the clinicians never could understand that. And he described the situation as a problem of situation, not disposition. It could be a mistake, and a very unfortunate one, to consider that what happened to us derived from malice or stupidity on the part of the staff. Quite the contrary. Our overwhelming impression of them was of people who really cared, who were committed, and who were uncommonly intelligent. Where they failed, as they sometimes did painfully, it would be more accurate to attribute those failures to the environment in which they too found themselves than to personal callousness. Their perceptions and behaviors were controlled by the situation rather than being motivated by a malicious disposition. So it's just a reminder that sometimes when you're in a certain setting with like common beliefs about things, it's very hard to think outside the box and to rely on your own. And that's why I think this importance of humility, as I mentioned. All right, so 2 slides on the implications for practice, and then I will be on my finishing up for this morning. So just to summarize, again, there was 2 points I wanted you to think about. One was dignity of risk and what that means, and how Robert Persky thought about it. Focusing on one set of risks while minimizing others has real-world consequences. People with fluctuating decisional capacity are able to make some decisions, And those without capacity can be supported to give input and weigh options, like I was talking about. There are positive aspects to risk-taking. Where is the line between safe and risky, and who decides? I think that who decides question is the one that I'm not really sure about, quite honestly. But I know that it's not always obvious who should decide, and it shouldn't always be that the person with the brain injury does not decide, if that makes sense. Do our biases about types of behavior or types of people impact our risk calculations? And the literature on effectively counteracting our own biases, like some of the things I was mentioning towards the end, it's mixed. But pausing in the moment, actively seeking out counter stories or counter narratives and counterfactuals, which those are like fancy words for just like different stories and different facts, can shake up our set ideas about a specific situation. And like pausing and talking to some of your colleagues, talking to some of your friends and loved ones, sometimes does give that space. And in rehabilitation, the practice of gathering various stakeholder perspectives can help to imagine more capacious and broad and open definitions of risk and safety. And that's it for today. Here's the outline to remind you of what I said. And again, thank you so much for your time and your attention this morning.
Doctor, before leaving, we do have a question from our online participants.
Sure,
from
please.
a Shelley Stevenson.
Yes.
Her question is, what do you recommend for healthcare providers to best support dignity of risk when a client has been found incapable to make personal care decisions and has another personal care worker making decisions on their behalf?
Wow, that's a really good question. No, and actually we were talking about that a little bit yesterday with some of the colleagues from the Vista Center. So I guess my answer would be, there is like the formal and the legal and the procedural person who makes decisions, and sometimes people are deemed to not have that capacity, but that doesn't mean that that person is no longer capable of making some decisions or giving input. And if you see, like over time, that the person who is supposed to be acting on their behalf does not have their best interest, does not have their own personal values highlighted, then maybe it might be time to try to even find a different person to speak for them. We see this, you know, I do ethics consultations at Cornell Medical School in New York City. And we get this question sometimes, like, you know, someone is completely, you know, they're in the ICU or something, so not able to tell us what they want. And their family member is saying this, but the staff are thinking, that's not really what we know about this person. So, you know, there are ways to think about, you know, who is the person that you're making the decision for? What are their values? What are their priorities? And how do you act towards like making it their best interest and not the best interest of the other person? But it's really complicated, and I think usually you have to do pretty egregious stuff to be like removed as someone's decision maker. That's the process and the legal part of it. But like informally, you can do like some coaching and some thinking and refocusing. Like I'll often go to the bedside and say, you know, tell me about your mother and what are the things she enjoyed doing? Have you ever talked about these things? Like open-ended questions to understand maybe who that person was and is. I hope I answered that question. And I think I still have 5 minutes for questions, or no?
Sorry, the mic over there?
Yes.
I'm just going to bring the mic to you.
I am wondering if there's a written copy of your presentation available somewhere. I process written language better than oral language, and I would find it very helpful to have a written copy.
Sure, I don't have a written copy, but I know they're going to be videotaping this, and there may be a transcript of it. It will be on the website, but this is being recorded. took some notes, but I was mostly speaking, but the transcription should give you most of the information. So hopefully it will be accessible, because it was a lot of information. So is there a written copy?
No, but good point. We'll make sure of it. We'll try and make sure that it is transcribed as well, because that's a good point.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
I'm often loud, but perhaps the mic is good. Thank you. Okay. I really want to thank you for your presentation, because I know there are a lot of people here who work in this and really are delighted to have your input. But I tell you, as a survivor, thank you very much for making it easy to understand and to feel like everyone in this room is equal. That is very important to me now as a brain injury survivor. I don't want to feel less than, and you did not do that, and I appreciate that very, very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And it's really a pleasure to be here and to be with all of you and to share this. All right, well, I hope you're going to be thinking about this, and if I see you later in the day, feel free to come up to me and ask me questions, or even later, get in touch with me. So thank you again.